Hey, what's up? It's Jake from Nimbus DevOps, and now we're going to talk about input parameters. So we talked a little bit at the beginning of the chapter about a function taking input parameters, but I want to just distinguish arguments and a little bit just to make this clear. So we'll cover three things. You got argument passing, which is really just assigning an object to a local variable name. Assigning an object to an argument name inside of a function and why that does not affect the caller, and then how that differs when you're working with mutable objects. So before we go any further, I want to make sure that we're on the same page. As defined by the Python documentation, a parameter defines the name that appears in a function definition, whereas an argument is the value passed to the function when you're calling it. You will see these used interchangeably, but they are absolutely two different things. So just know that if you're ever having this conversation, it gets confusing. So let's look at a simple argument example passing, just so you can kind of see it. So I'm going to say x is 3. I'm going to define a function that takes an argument y. Okay, and then I'm going to print y. Very, very simple. And then I'm just going to call function x. So what do you think this does? Well, if I print this out, you can see it prints 3. Why? Well, it assigns 3 to x, and then I define this function that takes an argument y and prints y. But instead of actually defining y, I'm calling function, and as a caller, I'm passing the argument x here. Okay, so this is my argument, and then the parameter as defined inside takes y. So it's just taking this as a y. Okay. So that might sound confusing, but that's how it works. That's just a simple argument passing kind of example. So let's look at parameter names. So let's say that I still have x is 3, but instead of printing x here, I'm going to say x equals 7. Okay. And then I'm going to call the function, and then in the global scope, I'm going to print x here. What do you think is going to happen? I still get 3. Why? Well, when you're executing this in the local scope, if you remember from my previous video, that defining a parameter or a variable inside of a function is scoped locally and does not affect the global scope. Therefore, when I call function and I pass the argument x equals 3, it's going to define this and basically do nothing and then print x equals 3, right? So there's 3. So what happens if we change this to a mutable object? Well, something interesting actually happens. So if I say x equals 1, 2, 3, and then I define a function that takes an argument x, and then I say give x at position 1, we're going to assign a value of 42. So we learned that defining something locally does not affect the global scope. However, this actually starts to change when you get into mutable objects, like this sequence list that we have here. So I'm going to call function, and I'm going to pass the argument x, which then here defines a parameter x at position 1, which would be the second number here, is 42. And we've actually augmented or changed this sequence, and we can see this by printing x. And you can see that example here, 1, 42, 3. So it doesn't seem like this should be possible, but it actually is. And this is quite useful because you're going to take input in the form of like an API call or a file or something like that, and then define a function to manipulate that data and then be able to do that. So that's, I'm guessing, why this is a thing. Because you'll notice if I just use regular old x and I just pass a string like something else, that because this is just a variable declaration to a non-mutable object, that it's not actually going to alter the global scope of x. And you can see that by running it again and see that even by declaring this variable, we get the same exact answer. So that is a basic overview of input parameters. I'm going to get in a little bit more detail with passing arguments and the different types of ways to pass an argument, but hopefully it's a good starting point. And if you have any questions, let me know.